says going live. Okay, here we go. As Richard Mather came of age, Richard Hakluyt was establishing himself as England's greatest promoter of overseas colonization. Hakluyt surrounded himself with a legion of travel writers, translators, explorers, traders, investors, colonizers, everyone who might play a role in colonizing the world, and began to mentor them. In 1597, he urged his mentee, John Pori, a recent Cambridge graduate, to complete a translation that may have been on Hakluyt's list for quite some time. Pori translated Leo Africanus's Geographical Histories of Africa into English in 1600. English readers consumed it as quickly as other Europeans had for decades, and they were just as impressed. So you finally began to see this mischaracterization of Africa finally gets translated into English for all of England to have access to this racial idea. Keep in mind, this happens in 1600, and the first set of recorded slaves reaches the Americas in 1619. So, literally less than 2 decades later, you have the results of this man's reading and writing hitting the Americas. English readers consumed it as quickly as other Europeans. In a long introduction, Pori argued that climate theory could not explain the geographical distinctions in color. He said they must be hereditary. He suggested that Africans were descended from Ham and the cursed son of Noah. Now, if you go and read the scriptures for yourself, you will see there is no such scripture where God curses Ham or where Noah curses Ham. He actually wound up cursing Canaan because Canaan participated in incest, which is something that has been misquoted and not understood for decades within the Christian community when people talk about the curse of Ham and what happened between Noah and Ham. It didn't happen with Ham. It actually happened with his son Canaan. Canaan was cursed because Ham participated in incest with his mother. And Canaan, result of that incestuous relationship. That's why Canaan was cursed by Noah. All right? So, just for clarity's sake, I just wanted to make that point. You can go study it out a little bit more. But the term that they used about covering your mother's nakedness actually refers to incest. Uncovering your father's nakedness is actually a term that was used in reference to incest and sleeping with your father's wife or your mother. All right. Whether they chose to illuminate the stamp of blackness through curse theory or climate theory, the travel writers and translators of the time had a larger common goal, and they accomplished it. They ushered in the British Age of Adventure. They were soon followed by another group called the playwrights. With the English literacy rate very low, meaning a lot of people were not reading, many more British imaginations were churned by the playwrights than by the travel writers. At the turn of the century, a respected London playwright from Stratford upon Avon was escorting English audiences back into the ancient world and around modern Europe from Scotland, Macbeth, and to Denmark, also known as Hamlet, to inferior blackness and superior whiteness in Italy, or the tragedy of Othello, the Moor of Venice. The racial politics of William Shakespeare's Othello did not surprise English audiences when it premiered in 1604. By the late 1500s, English dramatists were used to manufacturing Satan's black agents on earth. Shakespeare's first black character, the evil, oversexed Aaron in Titus Andronicus, first came to the stage in 1594. Down in Spain, dramatists frequently staged black people as cruel idiots in the genre called Comedias de Negros. So, what is the writer telling us? It's telling us that because of all of these racial ideas that were now being passed on to the English, people like Shakespeare began to help these racial ideas along with his writing and with his plays that became visual drama. All right, went to a movie theater, but they were plays. It became visual drama for people to begin to form certain ideas about black people during the time based on what the playwrights were putting out, because people weren't doing reading themselves. They were just watching movies. Sounds like 2018. They were just watching plays instead. So there became a whole genre back then in Spain where black people were made into this comical figure to be talked about and be laughed at, and it was called Comedias de Negros. And I would venture to ask the question, what is different in 2018 with some of the slapstick comedian stuff that we see, or with some of the what we might call today cooning and minstrelsy that we see happening on today? Shakespeare's Othello is a Moorish Christian general in the Venetian military, a character inspired by the 1565 Italian tale Glii Hecatomythi, and possibly by Leo Africanus, the Christian Moor in Italy who despised his own blackness. Othello's trusted ensign, Iago, resents Othello for marrying the Venetian Desdemona. For that I do suspect the lusty Moor hath leapt into my seat, Iago explains. To Desdemona's father, Iago labels Othello an old black ram, tupping your white ewe. Iago manipulates Othello to make him believe that his wife betrayed him. Her name, that was as fresh as Diane's visage, is now begrimed and black as my own face, Othello says before strangling Desdemona. At the play's climax, Othello realizes his dead wife's innocence and confesses to Emilia, Desdemona's maidservant. Oh, the more angel she, Emilia responds, and you the blacker devil. Othello then commits suicide. The theater loving Queen Elizabeth did not see Othello as she did some of Shakespeare's earlier plays. She died in 1603. When the deadly plague of 1604 subsided, her successor, King James I, arrived in London and started making plans for his grand coronation. King James I and his wife, Queen Anne of Denmark, saw Othello, but King James I commissioned Shakespeare's rival playwright, Ben Jonson, to produce an alluring international masque for his coronation and to mark the end of Elizabethan self isolation. Queen Anne proposed an African theme to reflect the new king's international focus. Leo Africanus' travel stories and Othello had sparked the queen's interest in Africa. Satisfying his queen, Jonson wrote The Masque of Blackness. Premiering on January 7th, 1605, in the Great Hall of London's sparkling Whitehall Palace, which overlooks the snowy banks of the Thames River, The Masque of Blackness was the most expensive production ever presented in London. Its elaborate costumes, exciting, dancing, sensational choirs, booming orchestras, exotic scenery, and a luxurious banquet caused all in attendance to marvel at the spectacle. Inspired by climate theory, it was the story of 12 ugly African princesses of the river god Niger who learn they can be, quote, made beautiful if they travel to Britannia, where the sun shine day and night and are of force, to blanch an Ethiop and revive a corpse. Queen Anne herself and 11 court ladies played the African princesses in blackface, inaugurating the use of black paint on the royal stage. The Masque of Blackness presented the imperial version of King James I, Prince Charles, Richard Hakluyt, and a powerful lineup of English investors, merchants, missionaries, and explorers. and it helped renew British determination to expand Britannia to America. King James chartered the London Company in 1606 with his eyes on North America. One eye on Virginia, another on New England. Although misfortune plagued the New England undertakings, Virginia fared better. Captain John Smith, a mentee of Richard Hakluyt, helped the command of the expedition of roughly 150 volunteers on the three boats that entered the Chesapeake Bay on April 26, 1607. Against all odds, and thanks to the assistance of the indigenous Powhatan Americans, North America's first permanent English settlement survived. His mission accomplished, John Smith returned as a hero to England in October 1609. So now, I hope you're beginning to see the connection between how one man, Leo Africanus, writing all of this false racial narrative about Africans, gets translated into English in 1600. That becomes widely read, which sparks the playwrights in England to begin to write stories about Africans based on his false presumptions, which then sparks the king's interest and the queen's interest in Africa, which then sparks Europe to go out and want to further their adventures toward the Americans, which then sparks them starting these new colonies in New England and Virginia, which then sparks 1619 Jamestown, the first group of slaves arriving on the shores of America. In colonizing Virginia and later New England, the British had already begun to conceive of distinct races. The word race first appeared in Frenchman Jacques de Brez's 1481 poem, The Hunt, where it referred, get this, to hunting dogs. As the term expanded to include humans over the next century, it was used primarily to identify and differentiate and animalize African people. The term did not appear in a dictionary until 1606, when French diplomat Jean Nicot included an entry for it. Race means descent, he explained, and it is said that a man, a horse, a dog, or another animal is from good or bad race. Thanks to this malleable concept in Western Europe, the British were free to lump the multi-ethnic Native Americans and the multi-ethnic Africans into the same racial groups. In time, Nicot's construction became as addictive as the tobacco plant, which he introduced in France. Captain John Smith never returned to Jamestown. He spent the rest of his life as the greatest literary mentee of Richard Hakluyt, promoting British migration to America. Thousands crossed the Atlantic, moved by Smith's exhilarating travel books, which by 1624 included his tale of Pocahontas saving his life. Pocahontas, the quote, civilized savage, had by then converted to Christianity, married an Englishman, and visited London. The English approved. Black people, however, did not fare so well, in Smith's estimation. Settlers read his worldly, or rather racist, opinions, though, and adopted them as their own. In his final book, published the year of his death in 1631, Smith told unexperienced New England planters that the enslaved Africans were, quote, as idle and as devilish as any in the world. Apparently, Smith thought this knowledge would be useful to the planters, probably knowing it was only a matter of time before enslaved Africans were brought to New England. But Smith was only recasting ideas that he had himself had heard in England between The Mask of Blackness, which was the play that used blackface, the founding of Virginia, and the founding of New England. Ideas that English intellectuals had probably learned from the Spanish enslavers and the Portuguese slave traders. Men that have low and flat nostrils are as libidinous as apes. A clergyman, Eric Topsell, explained in 1607 in History of the Four-Footed Beasts. King James made the common association of apes and devils in his 1597 book called Demon Monology. In one of his last plays, The Tempest, written in 1611, Shakespeare played on these associations of the ape and the devil and Africans in crafting Caliban, the hypersexual bastard child of a demon and an African witch from a vile race. In 1614, England's famous working class poet John Taylor said that, quote, black nations adored the, quote, black devil. In 1615, Address for the Planters in Ireland and Virginia, the Reverend Thomas Cooper said that white Shem, one of Noah's three sons, shall be lord over the cursed race of Ham, meaning Noah's son Ham in Africa. Future Virginia politician George Sandys also conjured curse theory to degrade blackness. In a 1620 paraphrase of Genesis, future politician Thomas Payton wrote of Cain, or, quote, the southern man, as the black deformed elf, and the northern white like unto God himself. 5 years later, clergyman Samuel Purchas released the gargantuan 4-volume Hackletus Posthumus of travel manuscripts left to him by his mentor Richard Hakluyt. Purchas blasted the filthy sodomists, sleepers, ignorant beasts, disciples of Ham, to whom the black darkness is reserved forever. These were the ideas about African people that were circulating throughout England and the English colonies. African people were being hauled into Britannia on slave ships. So, this doctrine of curse theory, this doctrine that was demonic in and of itself, that was trying to justify the treatment of black people, was becoming widespread from 1600 all the way into 1690, all the way into 1619, when the first slaves began to arrive on the shores of America. These people had already had racial ideas for 2 decades that they were operating off of before even bringing people into the colonies. So we need to understand that. In 1619, Richard Mather began ministering not far from the future center of the British slave trade, the port of Liverpool. In those days, the British slave trade was minuscule and Africans hardly existed in Britannia, but that would soon change. The vessels of slave traders were cruising deeper and deeper into the heart of West Africa, especially after the Moroccans, armed with English guns, crushed the Songhai Empire in 1591. The vessels of English commerce were cruising deeper and deeper into Virginia, too, as English merchants competed with the Spanish, the Portuguese, and rising Dutch and French empires. The first recorded slave ship to arrive in colonial America laden with African people was not originally intended for the English colonies. The Spanish ship San Juan Bautista departed Angola in July 1619, hauling 350 captives, probably headed for Veracruz, Mexico, excuse me. Latin American slaveholders had used racist ideas to craft a permanent slavery for the 250,000 Africans they held at the time. 2 pirate ships probably attacked the Spanish ship in the Gulf of Mexico, snatching some 60 captives, and then headed west. Weeks later, in August 1619, the pirates sold 20 of their Angolan captives in Jamestown to Virginia Governor George Yeardley, the owner of 1,000 acres. And as we traveled to Jamestown ourselves and we got a chance to be on the grounds where those slaves would have been bought and sold, we did get a chance to learn of one that was specifically named in the documents, and her name was Angelo. She was already noted to be a Christian when she came to the shores of America. So, this whole idea of slaves being completely ignorant and they had to learn their faith from the slave master, all of that needs to be re examined because many of the slaves were already Christians when they got here. All right. So, that's something that needs to be examined for those of you who are spouting that as a talking point and saying that black people were converted or slaves were converted into Christianity. Many of them were already believers when they came here. So, what was the reasoning behind enslaving them? John Pori, the translator of Leo the African's book into English, was Yeardley's cousin, and he ventured to Jamestown in 1619 to serve as Yeardley's secretary. On July 30th, 1619, Yeardley convened the inaugural meeting of elected politicians in colonial America, a group that included Thomas Jefferson's great grandfather. These lawmakers named John Pori their speaker, the English translator of Leo the African's book, who had defended curse theory, thus became colonial America's first legislative leader. So I want you to think about how deeply engraved are these theories about blackness, black people being cursed, started with the first legislative leader of the Americas. That's how deeply ingrained these theories are into the foundation of our country. John Pori set the price of America's first cash crop, tobacco, and recognized the need for labor to grow it. So, when the Angolans bound for slavery arrived in August, they were right on time. There is no reason to believe that George Yeardley and the other original enslavers did not rationalize their enslavement of African people in the same way that other British intellectuals did, and in the same way that Latin America slaveholders did. By considering these African people to be stamped from the beginning as a racially distinct people, as lower than themselves, and as lower in the scale of being than the more populous white indentured servants. In 1625, Virginia census did not list the ages or dates of arrival for most Africans, nor did the census list any of them, despite, in some cases, the fact that they had resided in Virginia for 6 years as free people. Africans were recorded as distinct from white servants. When Yeardley died in 1627, he willed to his heirs his goods, debts, chattels, servants, nagars, cattle, or any other thing. Nagars were dropped below servants in the social hierarchy to reflect the economic hierarchy. And this stratification became clear in Virginia's first judicial decision explicitly referring to race. The court ordered a white man in 1630 to be soundly whipped before an assembly of Negroes and others for abusing himself to the dishonor of God and the shame of Christianity by defiling his body in lying with a Negro. The court contrasted the polluted black woman and the pure white woman with whom he could lie without defiling his body. It was the first recorded instance of gender racism in America, of considering the body of the black woman to be a tainted object that could defile a white man upon contact. 1630, Virginia. Richard Mather never saw a slave ship leave the Liverpool docks during his ministerial tenure in Toxteth in the 1620s. Liverpool did not become England's main slave ship station until the 1740s, succeeding London and Bristol. British slave traders were slowly expanding their activities in the 1620s, unlike all those Anglican prosecutors of Puritans. The death of King James and the coronation of his son, Charles I, in 1625 set off a persecuting stampede. William Ames, a disciple of William Perkins, who was exiled in Holland, Steele, Richard Mather, John Cotton, and countless other Puritans with the marrow of the sacred divinity. Translated from Latin into English in 1627, the treaty described the sacred divinity of spiritual equality between a free man and a servant, the sacred divinity of inferiors owing subjection and obedience to their superiors, and the sacred divinity of, quote, our blood kin being given more love than strangers. The Marrow's explanation became a guiding principle for Mather's generation of Puritans settling the Massachusetts Bay Area in the late 1620s and 30s. Puritans used this doctrine when assessing Native Americans and African strangers, ensuring intolerance from the start in their land of tolerance. Beginning in 1642, Anglican monarchists and nonconforming parliamentarians locked arms in the English Civil War. As New England Puritans welcomed the nonconforming parliamentarians, Virginia's royalists prayed for their retreating King Charles I. But in 1649, he was executed, and 3 years later, Virginia was forced to surrender to the new ruling parliament. The economic hierarchy that had emerged in Virginia resembled the pecking order that William Ames had proposed and that Puritans had established in New England. Although their political and religious allegiances differed, large planters and ministers and merchants stood at the top, men like John Mottram of Virginia's North Neck, who used his power to acquire fertile land, solicit trade, procure labor, and keep legally free people like Elizabeth Key enslaved. All right. So when we come back, we're going to dig more into Elizabeth Key, the Virginia planters, and the white enslavers in Virginia, and how they continue to justify stamping people from the beginning with a doctrine of inferiority. I want to thank you for your time and attention today. I know it was a little bit frustrating on both ends. This has been part 2 of Daring Dialogues for today. I encourage you to go back and watch part 1 so you can catch the first half of our broadcast today. And Lord willing, we will not be having these broadcast problems on tomorrow. Remember, light is the most daring opposition to darkness, so please go out today and be light. Thank you again for your time and attention. Take care, and God bless.